The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review, part one, of Matt Dillahunty and Mike Licona, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? So I want to give a little background information on how this debate came about, what my original plan was, what was different about this event, and then we'll go into Mike Licona's opening statement and talk a little bit about what I think was problematic and perhaps what I even liked about it. When I was originally approached for this debate, it was suggested that I debate William Lane Craig. This happens all the time. I've discussed it over and over again. The most recent video from ReasonCon goes into detail, so there's not much reason to dig into that again. But the way it turned out, I ended up debating Mike Licona on Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? He's a New Testament scholar, historian, written a massive, thick book. And if the number of pages in a book were any indication of how likely something is to be true, I'd be convinced. It's a huge tome. Unfortunately, it doesn't really translate to this particular debate. So my plan going in, I knew that I was going to be standing in front of probably 400 or 500 Southern Baptists. Now, this was at the Unapologetics Conference. It's a traveling conference. So it wasn't Austin Baptist Church that was in attendance. It was Austin Baptist Church that was the venue, and Baptists, and I suppose non-Baptists from around the area came specifically to that church to learn about how to become better at apologetics. And I was honored to be invited. I enjoyed myself at the debate. And I want to make it clear that when I go through and do this debate review, when I point out mistakes and errors and fallacies and bad strategy, these are my opinions. They're not an assessment of the individuals. Dr. Licona and I got along just fine. We talked about magic and other stuff. But when it comes to the debate, this is a serious topic. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we pointed out was just how significant this is. If the resurrection isn't true, then all of Christianity is false and useless. And so I prepared for this debate knowing that standing in front of those individuals, I needed to take that into account. Now, when you're trying to figure out how to best reach an audience, and I've talked before about how debate may in fact be primarily theater, that you need to make a connection with the audience, what I try to keep in mind is that the debate is being recorded and it will reach many, many people with different views. It'll reach atheists, agnostics, it'll reach Baptists and Lutherans and Episcopalians and Catholics and Scientologists, perhaps, who knows. But there's no guarantee that the recording is ever going to make it out to the internet. And so the primary focus has to be the audience that is seated right there in that room. I know I'm going to get plenty of opportunities to debate the resurrection. I'm not always going to get the opportunity to present my reasons why I don't accept the resurrection to a room full of people who pretty much believe what I used to believe. I was primarily a Southern Baptist from the time that I walked down the aisle at the age of 5 until I eventually found my way out around the age of 30 or so. So I thought the most important things to address were to teach them about the null hypothesis, that we begin by default saying that there's no connection between A and B, and that this would include there's no connection between a God and existence, or someone reportedly being raised from the dead and someone actually being raised from the dead. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the burden of proof and what should convince us of extraordinary claims. Do we have the sort of evidence for the resurrection that would justify us accepting that this most probably happened? I'd also prepared for the minimal facts approach. I know Gary Habermas and Licona are their friends. They've worked together to talk about this. And there's another video that I've already put up that goes into the minimal facts approach in detail. But I prepared some notes about that, some notes about historical methods, about what we can and can't demonstrate and what sort of hypotheses we can support through the historical method. Licona takes a very different view, which we'll get to near the end of this video. And I'd also prepared to talk about the Gospels and demonstrating the unreliability of the Gospels, the fact that we're not necessarily hearing from eyewitnesses, and even if we were, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. That all changed after Licona's opening. And in this video, we'll go through parts of his opening statement and my thoughts on those. And in future videos, we'll finish up with my opening statement, which I modified on the fly because of what I encountered. This seems to me to be a pretty good strategy. Sometimes I'm good at it. This time maybe I wasn't so good at it. Maybe it became a little bit, wandering and confused, but we can consider that when we get to my opening. But let's start with Dr. Licona's opening, and this is where kind of the problems began.
All right, so this evening, or this afternoon I should say, I'm going to be making two major contentions. Number one, next slide please. Number one, empirical data strongly suggest that reality has a supernatural dimension. And number two, historical data strongly suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, let me start with that first major contention, that empirical data strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension, and I'm going to provide 4 lines of evidence in support.
So we've seen the beginning of Dr. Licona's opening, and he's going to present 2 lines of evidence. The first one is that empirical evidence strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension. I want you to focus on that language there and remember it because it's going to become important. Empirical evidence strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension. The second line of evidence is that empirical evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, there's a number of problems with this from the outset. First, the subject of the debate is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Which means that his second line of evidence is the only thing that's necessarily relevant to the debate. So why include this first line of evidence? He spent half of his 20-minute opening making an argument that it's reasonable to accept that reality has a supernatural dimension. This is curious because I can be convinced on the facts, on the merits, that Jesus rose from the dead without attributing it to the supernatural, without knowing what the cause is at all. We have essentially an effect, a fact, and you can demonstrate that there's good reason to accept this fact without positing any sort of cause, let alone appealing to a supernatural cause. In fact, later on in this debate, when he suggests that, if his head were to be chopped off and after some time he were to walk out into the other room and you could see the scar and he was clearly alive, would I accept that this happened? Yes, I would accept the empirical evidence of his death and the fact that he's not dead. And the question then became, well, would you accept that this is supernatural? And my answer was no, which incredibly frustrated him and some of the other people. And it took a while to sort out exactly why this is. We'll get to it a little bit later. It's why I wanted to focus on the language there, because there's an equivocation on his part where he shifts from supernatural, referring to a supernatural dimension, as if there is in fact some other dimension that has different properties and capabilities and can interact with the natural world and is supernatural. So now he's positing the supernatural as an explanation. And later on, he uses supernatural in a completely different context. But that's during the Q&A portion. I kind of want to save that a little bit. I can watch a magnet move iron filings around into patterns, observe the effect, and be as convinced as anything that this is actually occurring and not have an explanation for it. So from a strategic point, if I'm debating the subject, did Matt make a salami sandwich yesterday? It seems strange to have 2 lines of evidence. The second one being there's empirical evidence to suggest that Matt made a salami sandwich yesterday, which is the only one that seems relevant to the subject of the debate. It seems extraneous to add a primary or a first introductory line of evidence to address the issue of whether or not we have good reasons to believe that something like a salami sandwich is possible. It's superfluous, except that it fills a strategic obligation. The entire subject of the debate is, did Jesus rise from the dead? So only the elements from the second half of his opening, where he presented his lines of evidence for Jesus rising from the dead, seems relevant to me. And it seems that spending half your time arguing that it's reasonable to think that magical things can happen is a bit of kind of poisoning the well. It seems to be an attempt to say we want to present our evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, but just in case some people might not think it's particularly plausible, we need to also demonstrate that the supernatural, the magical, is plausible, because that will make people more likely to accept that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's putting the cart before the horse. But I want to first take a look at how he argued that empirical evidence suggests that reality might have or strongly suggests that reality does have a supernatural dimension. And he does that in part by talking about Ouija boards, moving trash can lids, ghost stories, near-death experiences, and answered prayer. Let's take a look.
All right, so paranormal experiences, there are things such as, demonic experiences, or however you may want to call it, but ghosts, something like that. But paranormal experiences, well, this is a friend of mine. Her name is Kim. I've known her for several years. Kim, her mom, her sister, and several of her family members have dabbled in occultic practices over the years. She's told me about some of the things that she has seen, kind of stuff that makes the hair on the back of your neck would stand up. They were playing with a Ouija board in her kitchen, and they're in high school at the time. And so they're playing the Ouija board, and there's this metal trash can with a metal lid in the kitchen. I said, Kim, a metal trash can and lid in your kitchen? She said, well, we lived out in the country, you know. So as they're playing the Ouija board, all of a sudden, they saw the lid, the metal lid on the can, just lift up and hover over the can for a moment, and then it launched itself against the wall, hits the wall, goes flat against the wall, and it's as though someone was holding it against the wall, and then it just slid down real slowly down the wall, and then when it hit the ground, it started to spin like a coin.
I've spoken before, and there are other videos about science's inability to confirm the supernatural. We don't have a way to investigate it. We don't have a definition for it. We don't know what it is. And the definition for it becomes relevant in this particular debate, which I'll get to in a little bit. But basically, his justification for believing that the evidence strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension is because he has friends who he trusts who have told him rather curious stories. Here's a story about we're messing with a Ouija board and a trash can lid moves, or somebody wakes up at 2:30 in the morning and sees an apparition of a face of a friend of theirs and a face that appears demonic or devilish, and they pray and it goes away, and later they find out that this person died at 2:30 at a concert. He talks about apparitions and labels them spirit beings, and my question is, how did he conclude that these are in fact spirit beings? How did he conclude that these aren't merely hallucinations, that there's the mind playing tricks on us? Or we know that, and we'll get to this later too, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. We exaggerate stories, we misremember facts. Going through all of this and saying essentially, oh, well, somebody prayed, we had a prayer vigil, and the exact amount of money we need came in. Okay, that's interesting. How did you determine what the cause was? That the cause was you prayed and some supernatural being took steps to fulfill that prayer. I understand that this is what you believe. I'm doubting how you came to that conclusion. We hear stories about alien abductions and ghost stories. Half of the History Channel is a bunch of garbage related to this as well, where we're going out and trying to explore. It's curious to me because my version of Christianity, when I was in, would have just written off ghosts as demons. Because once you're dead, your spirit either went to heaven or hell, and that's where it stayed. It didn't come back and haunt people or show up as apparitions or poltergeists or any of that. We would have said all of it was demons. He didn't actually determine whether he thought it was demons or actual apparitions. He kind of meanders back and forth between this is what people reported and they are convinced of it, and this is the fact. And those two things are not synonymous. What people are convinced of, the explanations that people come up for the experiences that they've had, don't necessarily tie to reality. So we spend 10 minutes roughly of his opening arguing that ghost stories and Ouija boards and near-death experiences and supposed answered prayer actually support the idea that reality has a supernatural realm. But there's no demonstration of this at all. And what's wrong with the hypothesis that human beings are flawed thinkers who are subject to hallucinations, that are subject to misinterpretations, that are subject to lying and exaggeration? And the mere fact that someone had an experience doesn't mean that their interpretation or explanation for that experience is correct. You know, I talk to friends of mine who are believers, and they tell me that they've had an experience that they attribute to the Holy Spirit. I'm happy to accept that they are doing their best to accurately relay the experience they had. That doesn't mean I'm convinced of their explanation, and it also doesn't mean that I should be. Anecdotal evidence that people attribute experiences to the supernatural is not, in fact, evidence for the supernatural. If anything, it's strong evidence of flawed thinking in human beings, until such time as there's actual empirical evidence for the supernatural. So his first statement, that there's empirical evidence that strongly suggests reality has a supernatural dimension, he doesn't make that case. Instead, it should be reworded to say that there is empirical evidence that people make claims that attribute experiences to the supernatural, and that's independent of whether or not the supernatural actually exists. He goes on to talk a little bit about answered prayer and makes this statement.
Here is there seems to be a spiritual dimension. Reality is a little more complex than than atheism would claim. Okay, and then fourth, you've got extreme answered prayer. Now, look, anybody in here is a Christian. You know that we pray. You could probably make a list of some answered prayers. I prayed before I flew down here from Atlanta yesterday. God, get me there safely. Well, the fact that I arrived in Austin safely, was that an answered prayer? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe the plane was going to have some problems and it didn't after all. I don't know.
So here he acknowledges that he can't be confident that a prayer was actually answered. And then he goes on to argue that sometimes it's just too much. It can't be coincidence. It must be answered prayer. Take a look.
Anyway, most of our prayers, sometimes there are class A answered prayers. These are like extreme answered prayers, radically answered prayer. There's just too much there to think of them as just being coincidence.
So now we're halfway through his opening statement, and we have yet to hear anything at all about the resurrection. We have ghost stories and anecdotes, and somebody told me this story, and people have investigated near-death experiences, and while some of them are faked, there's others that don't seem like they could have been faked, and therefore we have reason to believe that the reality has a supernatural dimension. No, we actually don't. But anyway, what exactly is his evidence for the resurrection? That's the whole point of this debate.
So I'm going to go with what historians regard as the very finest evidence for the resurrection, and that's Paul. He's our ace. And the reason he's good is because Paul, we know, was a skeptic. He was a non-believer. He didn't like the Christians. He believed it was God's will to destroy the movement that Jesus had started. And so he goes out and he was arresting Christians, sending them to prison, consenting to their executions. And then he became one when he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him.
So we've moved on to the part of his opening where he talks about evidence for the resurrection. And he begins with, let's talk about facts and methods. Now, I think a careful walkthrough here, there may be some equivocation on what facts are there. We'll talk about methods a little right near the end of his opening statement. But the facts that he's going to present, because he's short on time, aren't the Gospels at all. This caused me to change some things in my opening, but that's fine. He wants to rely on Paul because he says that Paul is our best source of information for the resurrection. Now, he and I will have a little back and forth on this later on during the Q&A because based on my understanding, Paul never met the living Jesus. Licona suggests that may not be true, but I don't know what his evidence is for it other than to say you can't prove he didn't meet Jesus. But he talks about Paul because Paul's writings are the earliest. They were written ostensibly by most historians prior to the Gospels. And Paul actually goes out and interacts with the apostles. This basically says, here's the earliest writing. It's written by Paul and affirmed by the apostles, and that's why it's the most reliable. But he does a number of curious things here. He calls Paul a skeptic. Now, was Paul a skeptic? Was there, I mean, it certainly didn't fit into modern scientific skepticism. We're talking way pre-Enlightenment, and the Greek ancient version of skeptic doesn't really fit here. So if in fact that he even fit into an ancient Greek version of skeptic, that doesn't match with modern day skepticism. Doesn't match with this idea that you're going to use critical thinking skills, apply rigorous standards of evidence, and find the best methods to determine whether or not something is true. So after saying that Paul's a skeptic, how does Licona describe Paul? Which you would assume would be kind of his summation. Paul's a skeptic, and he says he was a non-believer who didn't like Christians and believed it was God's will to destroy the movement. That doesn't sound like a skeptic. I mean, it seems, why would you even put the word skeptic in there? And then the description you're going to offer immediately after has nothing to do with modern skepticism, has nothing to do with standards of evidence. Basically, it's almost like a slur. Oh, Paul was a skeptic, just like skeptics. He was a non-believer, yet he thought it was God's will to destroy the movement. So he was only a non-believer in Christianity, and he hated Christians. And that doesn't really jive with skepticism at all. He notes that Paul became a Christian, and he says this more than once, when Paul had an experience which he believed was the risen Jesus. That's not evidence for the proposition that Jesus rose from the dead. That is Paul having an experience. Paul wasn't at the crucifixion, so far as we know. He wasn't at or anywhere near or participating in the resurrection. This was all around the apostles. He just had an experience, came to believe, and this is Licona's best line of evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. Nothing about the death process, nothing about the burial, nothing about the empty tomb, just Paul had an apparition, an experience of vision, and he attributes that to the risen Jesus. And then Paul goes off to meet with Peter to make sure that he's preaching the right gospel, which is strange because if you've had an actual engagement with the risen Jesus, why would you need to affirm what you're teaching with anyone else? Only in the sense of, hey, we have potentially competing stories here. Let's either make sure we've got all our ducks in a row and we're in agreement, or let's be supportive of each other. But what would happen if Peter and them disagreed? They did disagree. And some of that information is included in Acts. If Jesus comes down and tells me exactly what he wants me to preach, I don't need to go to anybody else. So this is a bit of kind of evidentiary finagling or roping to say Paul's our best line of evidence because he had an experience with a vision of Jesus, an interaction with the risen Jesus, which implies that Jesus had in fact risen. And then that he went on to confirm with the apostles that he was teaching the right thing. Then he starts to talk a little bit about the historical method. How do we know that Paul was telling the truth?
So according to Paul, they certified he's teaching the same thing they're teaching. Now, as historians, we can look and say, well, how do we know that Paul was telling the truth? Maybe he was just making up that story to give himself authority that he really didn't have.
So essentially, Peter's student says that Paul was telling the truth or accurately relaying the Gospels, and John's student says essentially the same thing. He goes on to acknowledge that Paul inherited and accurately relayed an oral tradition. But the accuracy with which you relay the story that was relayed to you is independent from whether or not the story itself is accurate. I can tell you the story of Harry Potter, and I can demonstrate how accurate it is to the original, which doesn't tell you whether or not the original is true. So finally, we get on to what he claims are virtually indisputed assertions. A short, quick, unsupported list of the minimal facts. Just takes a few seconds to hit these really quickly. I don't know how much we actually addressed any of these. And this is essentially the key approach, the minimal facts approach to these things happened, how do we best explain them? And instead of focusing on any of the verifiable aspects of this, he just says these are pretty much virtually undisputed.
So our historical bedrock that we get from this, again, this is virtually undisputed in the world of scholarship, no matter if you're an atheist, agnostic, Jewish, or Christian scholar. A number of Jesus' disciples believed the risen Jesus appeared to them. These experiences occurred in individual and in group settings. And third, the skeptic Paul became a Christian when he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him.
So people believe that Jesus appeared to them. I'm not quite sure how that demonstrates anything about a resurrection, but this is one of his indisputable facts. People were convinced that Jesus appeared to them, but what people are convinced of is independent of what's real. This was experienced by both individuals and groups, and later on he argues that group hallucinations are seemingly impossible, despite the fact that we may have evidence to support the idea that group hallucinations are possible. But in the end, we're still talking about stories of hallucinations, not actually group hallucinations that we have any way of confirming. And third, the skeptic, here we go again labeling Paul a skeptic, the skeptic Paul became a Christian after having a vision. So the three minimal facts that he listed don't actually address the resurrection at all. They address what people believed about the resurrection, the fact that there were experiences that were reported by individuals and groups, and then Paul, who he wants to label a skeptic, probably in order to show that even a skeptic became convinced, had an experience with the risen Jesus. But he also acknowledges that this was Paul's interpretation of this experience. So how do we get to the facts? What is it about the historical method that would allow us to conclude that the most reasonable explanation for these facts is that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead?
So what do we do with method? Well, the mechanism that historians use to determine what's probable, every discipline has something different, what historians use, historical method, arguments of inference to the best explanation. And we use four important criteria in assessing hypotheses in this manner. The first one is explanatory scope. This is the ability of a hypothesis to account for the maximum number of facts. So a hypothesis that can account for 3 facts is superior to one that can only account for 1 or 2. Explanatory power is the ability of a hypothesis to account for these facts without forcing them to fit, without excessive ambiguity, or placed a different way. If a hypothesis is true, we expect certain things, and to the degree we get these, that hypothesis is said to have explanatory power. So let's say we've got a guy who's been in prison for 20 years overseas. He comes to the United States. His brother greets him at the airport, and he says, "Bro, you're not going to believe this, but last year the Chicago Cubs won the World Series." He says, "Yeah, I don't believe it. What kind of evidence do you have?" "Well, what do you want?" "Well, if the Cubs won, we would expect a celebratory parade, right?" "Yeah." So he shows him some evidence for that parade. That shows that the hypothesis has explanatory power. Less ad hoc. Number 3, ad hoc is a term meaning for this. You don't want a hypothesis where there's a lot of conjecture, contrivance involved. You don't want that. Something where there's a lot of non-evidenced assumptions. It's like undetectable gremlins from Saturn are responsible for all the unexplained phenomena on Earth is entirely ad hoc. The hypothesis that is least ad hoc is to be preferred. And finally, plausibility. This is the degree to which a hypothesis is compatible with our background knowledge. And so the hypothesis that a 3-year-old girl bench pressed 300 pounds is implausible based on our background knowledge of what humans are capable of doing under their own power. Same thing with raising from the dead by natural causes, implausible. But if God exists and wants to raise Jesus, all bets are off. That's a game changer.
So gremlins serves as an ad hoc explanation without evidentiary support, but a magical, supernatural being operating from a supernatural dimension to influence the natural world isn't. It's a shame that Licona doesn't seem to understand skepticism. All this talk about Paul being a skeptic, it'd be very nice if if apologists in general, and Licona in particular in this case, had a better understanding of modern skepticism, about a better understanding of modern scientific methods, about how we go about exploring these things. Instead, it seems that there's almost nothing that he won't believe if he trusts the source. A friend of mine had this experience and they say it was supernatural, therefore it is. Somebody prayed and it happened, and while we can't say for sure that it was answered prayer, it just seems like too much of a coincidence. None of this is skepticism, and there's no demonstration that there's any real understanding of skepticism. But also, where's the demonstration of the plausibility of God? If we're going to talk about historical methods making appeals to the best hypothesis, and that this hypothesis has to be plausible, this then explains why he's trying to talk about ghost stories and answered prayer and other things, because it props up this notion of the supernatural dimension as if it's plausible, and therefore tries to leech off of that plausibility to say that God is possible, and that it's possible that if, God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, that's just a game changer. Well, yes, it is. But where's the demonstration that there is a God and that this God wanted to raise Jesus? These are just assumptions that are being made. These are the assumptions that undergird everything about his position on the resurrection. In fact, I'd argue that he doesn't believe the resurrection because he believes that supernatural is plausible. I think that he argues that the supernatural is plausible because he already accepts the resurrection. In my opening and rebuttals, I talk a little bit about the limits of the historical method, about how you can't confirm a miracle or a supernatural event, about Bart Ehrman's claim that because it's the least possible explanation by definition, you don't even get to appeal to it, about the scientific foundations. We'll go through all that. In the next segment, we'll take a look at my opening statement and the rebuttals. There are a few shocking statements made. A couple of snide remarks, although not directed at me. And again, I want to say that, we got along, and this isn't a personal thing. This is primarily, let's look at the substance of the arguments. And in a 20-minute opening, we spent 10 minutes talking about ghost stories and other things that lead him to think that the supernatural is plausible. Things that don't convince me that the supernatural is plausible at all. Things that, by and large, even other believers seemed puzzled that he would spend so much time talking about the supernatural. I talked to two different apologists after this debate was over, apologists that are friends of mine that I've had debates and conversations with. And they were both kind of a little staggered that there seemed to be this dishonest and inaccurate attempt to prop up the supernatural is plausible in order to act as a support for his claims about the resurrection, because there was virtually nothing about the resurrection itself. When he starts saying, let's talk about the facts and the methods, he doesn't talk about facts of the resurrection. He talks about the fact that Paul converted because Paul had an experience that he interpreted as being with the risen Jesus. He doesn't talk about the fact that Jesus appeared to people. He talks about the fact that people believe that Jesus appeared to them, and doesn't have any way to establish any of this. Lastly, when we continue on, we'll talk a little bit more about the supernatural, because early in the debate he begins by arguing that reality seems to have a supernatural dimension. And later on, he uses the term supernatural in a completely different way. It's almost like this initial argument for the supernatural exists solely to prop up a foundation for his preferred ad hoc explanation. And it morphs quickly into a definition of the supernatural that is roughly equivalent, as I pointed out during the debate, to saying the supernatural is the label for the bucket where we dump all of the things that we don't understand, all of the things that seem impossible based on our current understanding of the natural world. Well, that's an equivocation. Putting a label on unknowns, you can have as many unknowns as you want. It's not going to get you to a known. You don't get to say that we have good reason to believe that the resurrection occurred and that there is a supernatural dimension which could possibly serve as an explanation, if you're also just saying that the supernatural is a label that we put on things until we have an explanation, which is exactly what he says later on. But we'll get to some of that in part 2 and perhaps part 3. Again, I made lots of mistakes as well. I know we're going to get to those in the next one. But his opening sets the tone for the entire debate. And if we're going to spend so much time talking about the supernatural, it seems that perhaps we had the wrong debate topic, because I'm not convinced that there is a factual, empirical argument, an argument rooted in empirical facts, which is his entire second line. The empirical evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. What empirical evidence is this? Because the evidence, as I pointed out, was not, hey, there's an empty tomb. Hey, there's this. Hey, there's this piece of physical evidence related. None of it. It is, let's go back and read the stories, and people relay their experiences, and we'll just trust them. Just like I trust my friend with the moving trash can and trust my other friend who tells me I have good reason to believe that near-death experiences occur. We'll see you next time. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.